All right, guys, we're going to start chapter 13, the Renaissance and Reformation. So, as always, when we start a new chapter, go to a new page in your notebook at the top, chapter 13, the Renaissance and Reformation. This is our last chapter of the semester. This is the last material you will add to your unit that you'll be quizzed and assessed on. And yes, this will be on your final. Okay, gentlemen, so I'm sure you've heard the word Renaissance before, so what I'm going to do is be adding to whatever pre-existing knowledge you have of it. The Renaissance, literally as a word, means rebirth, and what was being reborn is basically culture, art, knowledge, and education. I don't want to give you the impression that in the Middle Ages there wasn't things like education. They had universities. But there are some parts of society of Europe that had declined and there was less focus on during the Middle Ages, just naturally because big parts of the Middle Ages, like specifically the Dark Age, were just about people trying to survive. And now what happens in specifically in parts of Italy, people start to look around and they see buildings that have now been there for thousands of years, and the people of the Middle Ages realize they couldn't build them. They can't recreate the same level of three-dimensional statues. And there's this idea, it's like, why are we not capable of as doing as well as the people of the past? And that's where there's this real push now to push humanity specifically forward on art and learning. And what two cultures do they look at in the past? It's the Greeks and the Romans. And the reason why is because that's what they see all around them. They see, they see the Colosseum, they see the Greek Parthenon. They see these buildings that they would have a very difficult time constructing. So they want to not only catch up to what was done in the past, but they want to surpass it. And I'll give you an example. Right on the screen right now is a picture of Christ and Mary and a few apostles. And this is a medieval tapestry. Let me show you an earlier work done by the Romans, just to show you the difference. So this is done in the Middle Ages. What I'm about to show you is older work. Like, when you see that, you can clearly tell, okay, wow, that takes a lot of skill. And you can see in the Renaissance, they weren't focusing on that as much. And so now they're saying, well, why can't we do this that people whatever 1,500 years ago were able to do? Why can't we do that? And so that's really what's going to be reborn here through this focus on this processes to push the culture forward. So the Renaissance really begins in Italy, and there's a couple reasons why. One is it was the center of the Roman Empire, and in the Roman Empire, they had all these great buildings and all these statues and all these artifacts of the past and architecture of the past that people can see. See how strange that would be? Imagine living in a society where there are these giant monuments and buildings that were constructed, but they were constructed before your current civilization or before your current society, and you can't recreate those. Imagine how almost embarrassing it would be that you have this giant building that you can't build. But so that's part of the reason. The other part of the reason for this happening in Italy is Italy had become incredibly wealthy. The Italian city-states, there was a ton of wealth. A lot of it was because Italy was a great place to do trading in, but also because some of the city-states, based on what they were producing, was bringing in wealth. And some of them were focusing on construction of buildings, some were focused on the construction of ships, and some were on art. And inside these city-states where there was so much wealth, you had people called patrons. A patron were people who had so much wealth that they had to invest it in something. What they would do is they would invest it in artists. They would tell an artist, hey, I want something that looks like this, and I'm willing to pay you for it. That's where, if you've ever heard of the website Patreon, it's the same idea. It's like you will pay someone for creating art that you like, and that's what a patron is. Now, so let's talk a little bit more about the city-states. Specifically, there are two that we need to know for the purpose of this class. One is Venice. And if you've never seen Venice, it was actually in one of the last Spider-Man movies. It's a city with lots of channels. And to get from place to place in parts of Venice, you have to be on boats. You have to be on gondolas or boats. People's homes are built, like when you open up your door to your house, like there's water in front of you. If you look at the video I have linked on here, you can actually see how bizarre landscape, the topography, the geography of Venice is. It's very lock and channel driven. Like where we would have streets, they would have rivers. And because of that, they're experts. They're expert shipbuilders. Like from all over, people come to the Venetians for shipbuilding. Their rival city-state is Florence, and Florence is known for its art guilds. An art guild is a place where there would often be like a main artist, often a male, would be a male, and they would send younger male artists to him, and they would be in a guild together. And as they moved up, they'd be exposed to better and better artists, and eventually they may actually work with the main artist. And they would have basically a school. So imagine Moeller, but from classroom to classroom, you'd be learning different art skills, and you would take these throughout Europe. So we're going to talk about the new ideas and art that comes from that. Specifically, we're going to talk about three specific artists. Before we get to that, we have to talk about this new concept called humanism and the impact it has on people. So during the Renaissance, people start to focus on humans and human society and the advancement of pushing humanity forward. Now, that has some very good impacts. Like, imagine that if you start to say, well, this life matters, you're going to start creating better medicines, probably better education systems, stronger governmental institutions, because if this is the life that you get, you want to make sure that it both lasts as long as possible and you have the greatest quality of life. The problem with humanism is it eventually spins out of control, where basically humans become the only focus for people's lives. And not only that, but like humanity almost becomes like the center of the universe and the thing that only matters. And eventually that spins into some other philosophies, which I'm going to cover in a second. But during this time period, now you get a real decline of the power of the church because people are not worrying about the next world. They're only worrying about this one. So that's going to lead to, this is something I want to talk to you about. So we understand the pros and the cons of humanism and the implications of it as a philosophy, because we've talked about philosophies before, and we're definitely going to talk about philosophies moving forward in the second semester. So what are the pros to humanism? As I put up here, it leads to the idea that people could change their lives and they can make society better. If this life matters, let's make it count. Let's make it so as many people as possible can have as long a life as possible. But what's the con? Soon people only care about themselves. Humanism tends to spin into what's called materialism, and it's a focus on physical comforts. And I want you to really consider American society today. If you really care about this life and that becomes the only focus and not about eternal consequences, you naturally tend towards thinking that, okay, well, if this is all I get, then I should eat, drink, and be merry because tomorrow I die. I should have as much rich foods and drink and live in all the most comfortable circumstances possible because I'm dead and nothing else matters. And the thing about this sounds a little bit like America today. Well, there's one more step because materialism tends towards another philosophy, and that's eventually nihilism. Nothing matters. Does anything really matter? If it's all comfort based and you're going to die anyway, why does anything matter? Why would you save an animal that's sick on the side of the road? Why would you help anything? Why not let an animal species go extinct? What's the matter? At the end of the day, we're all going to be dead anyway. Every single person's going to die. And so why does anything matter? That's nihilism. And these things lead to each other. Humanism, this focus on this life mattering and nothing else beyond that, leads to materialism. I should have a comfortable life, and that's the primary goal. And then that eventually leads to the fact that, well, who cares about does any of this stuff really matter? And it leads to nihilism. And if you look around in American society today, you see a pretty strong bent towards nihilism. Why does anything matter? Because ultimately everyone is going to be dead anyway. So I just wanted to cover that and the implications of those philosophies. So here's one. This is Friedrich Nietzsche, one of our esteemed philosophers of the 20th century. Look at this. Everything in the world displeases me, but above all, my displeasure in everything displeases me. This is classic nihilism, right? At some point you realize nothing matters. How about this? The only absolute knowledge attainable by man is that life is meaningless. Tolstoy. These are major thinkers of the 20th century. So the impacts of humanism turning to materialism, turning to nihilism, is something that we're all dealing with. Okay, moving on though. So now what we're going to do is going to cover one of these these are one of these big people in history. They really matter. And when I say big or important, I don't necessarily mean good. And this guy writes one of the most controversial books ever. I've seen historians put this on the top 10 most evil books ever written. Its impact is massive, and we need to talk about Niccolo Machiavelli. Machiavelli, who's very much influenced by humanism, creates a guidebook for monarchs, and the book is called The Prince. 1513 is the year it was written. And the whole purpose of the book is teaching a monarch how to get power and retain power. This is power for power's sake. You want to have as much power for as long as possible. You're trying to maximize your ability to control people and things and events. And so this saying, which you may have heard before, the end justifies the means. If you get what you want, it doesn't matter how you get there. That is a major theme of his book. Consider that. So the ends justify them. That may sound good to you, right? Like, well, if I want, I got world peace, some people had to suffer. Well, let's use an example of the ends justify the means just to see that if you're really on board with that. I could cure homelessness. I could cure it probably in America in about 2 months. Would you, and if you'd be willing to give me the resources, it could be done. We would just simply have to kill every homeless person in the United States. Then there'd be no more homeless people, right? Does the end, no homelessness, justify the means? No, we don't believe that. But this impact, this philosophy has a major influence on European thinkers and a major influence on European politicians moving forward. So with Machiavelli, he's not concerned with what's morally right, but what's effective. And when you strip away morality from the what its impact is, you get some really wild outcomes, which we're eventually going to get to when we get to the 20th century. So here's a classic saying: it is better to be feared than loved if you cannot be both. So what Machiavelli is saying here? Hey, if you can be feared and loved as a manager, as a leader, as a teacher, you should be. But if you have to pick fear, because fear motivates people in a much stronger way than love. Now, I'm not saying I agree with that, but that's the type of philosophy that he's bringing to the table here. Now, I want you to consider this. Mr. Rico always asks this, and I would have done this in class with you. I want you to think about Moeller. What teachers in the building use love as a form of motivation for you? We definitely have a bunch of them, right? They use primarily love. They're always pushing for you to do your best. They're always willing to make that extra sacrifice or do whatever to make sure that you feel comfortable and you feel loved. Think to yourself, what are some of the teachers that are in the love? Now I want you to consider what teachers in this building use fear as their primary motivator for you. At the end of the day, you do not want to cross these people because you don't know how far they're willing to go to punish you, to make you comply, to make you do what is needed. Think about those. And lastly, think about teachers that use both. They both use fear when necessary, and they use love, a culture of love in their classrooms. Machiavelli, rightly or wrongly, would say those teachers are the strongest leaders because their impact will go furthest. Just consider that, just an application of the material to the real world. So you don't have to write these, but I do want to at least go through this a little bit. These are the only things you want. Just let's take a listen to some of the advice. I cut it out of the Prince. He said, if an injury has to be done to a man, it should be so severe that his vengeance should not be feared. So if you have to hurt someone, you do it so horribly that you'll never worry about revenge coming from them. There is no other way to guard yourself against flattery than making men understand that telling you the truth will not offend you. This is one of the big themes he has in his book, too, where he says, look, nothing is worse than self-delusion. You have to understand what you are and what the other person is and in your relationship to the power that people around you have and perceive you to have. The first method for estimating the intelligence of a ruler is to look at the people around him. This is something I would actually tell you in your own lives. When you look at groups of people, when you look at different groups of people, are they smart people? Who do people surround themselves with? Are they smart people? Or are they brave people? Are they silly people? He would say that the people you surround yourself with tells you a lot about who you are. Everyone sees what you appear to be, but few experience what you truly are. and then never attempt to win by force, which you can get through deception. So look, is there some interesting advice here? Is there some potentially useful advice? Yes. But again, that idea of the ends justifying the means is very dangerous. So wisdom consists of knowing how to distinguish the nature of trouble and choosing the lesser evil. All right, let's move forward. All right, so let's talk about this concept of Renaissance men. A Renaissance man, as that term is used, is someone who is a genius at multiple things. It is not someone who's great at one thing or brilliant. We're talking about people who are the best in the world at multiple things. And the three that I picked for the purposes of this class are Leonardo da Vinci, Michelangelo, and Raphael. And so Leonardo da Vinci is probably the quintessential Renaissance man. He was a scientist and an artist and architecture. He was brilliant. So he used to pay people to bring him human corpses. At that time, it was illegal to dissect corpses, but he would take them and cut them open so he could actually see the mechanisms of inside the human body, so he could both sketch them and understand them, how humans worked, the physiology. He's famous notebooks, and like you're actually seeing a picture of that bird wing is like just one of his notebooks. He would take animals and like random objects and break them down so he could understand them. The Last Supper, which I'll show you in a minute, is definitely one of the big works that he's done, and the Mona Lisa. And we're going to literally do a whole warm-up just on the Mona Lisa and talk about why that's an important work. Michelangelo, painter and sculptor. And when I say painter and sculptor, I'm saying brilliant painter and genius level sculpting, maybe some of the best stuff any human's ever done on the planet. And he both did the Sistine Chapel, which is the entire ceiling of a chapel in Italy. And he also did the David statue, which is a quintessential work of sculpture, which was done on a throwaway piece of granite. And then Raphael's interesting because Raphael both did sculpture, but he also did painting. But his painting was done in an art style called the fresco. Fresco means fresh. As these walls are being constructed, like as they're putting up this almost drywall material, he would actually paint onto it, and so it would fuse with the wall, both making the color and the permanence of it change as he did the work. And I'll show you some of those. The most renowned is called the School of Athens, which is we're actually referring to Plato's school that we covered a few units ago. So let's take a look at these. So the Last Supper, this is Leonardo da Vinci. I would rather cover this in class with you in person, but just a couple things, just to show you how just absolutely insane this work is if you ever talk to any artist, they'll always tell you the hardest thing to draw, without a doubt, on the human body are people's feet. Feet, hands, nobody likes to draw them. They're hard. And feet in particular. And if you look at the work, where he has, obviously, he's depicting Jesus' last meal with the apostles. If I was drawing that like that, why would I leave that space so you can see their feet under the table? It would make more sense. You would think you would crop it up so it would start at the table. That's not the point. Da Vinci wants you to see their feet. He wants you to see that he has no problem doing that. That's part of the work. And you have all the different lightings under the table, above the table, people's feet at different angles. He's showing you this is how good I am. Look how dark part of the room is. Part of the room is pitch black, and then it goes to very bright. That's almost like a chiaroscuro, like this light to dark. The room has dimensionality, and there's even another still life in the background. There's action happening. There are people's faces in every possible direction they could be. This is just Leonardo showing you how good he is. All right, regarding the Mona Lisa, I don't want to say too much about this because we're going to literally do an entire warm up just on her. But the Mona Lisa is often considered the most important painting ever done. And the reason for that is that it utilizes a few forms of art that Leonardo invented or he just started utilizing first. One technique is sfumato. It's where you basically make the painting so light that it makes transparencies. The Mona Lisa's been cleaned poorly, so it removed layers of paint off her accidentally. She used to have eyebrows, and that was removed, but you can actually still see the veil on her. The Mona Lisa also utilizes what's called a three-quarter pose, which means she doesn't look at you straight and she doesn't look at you profiled. She looks at you three quarters. This is much more difficult to draw, but the thing about it is, this becomes the standard. Before this, if you ever look at European paintings, all of them are sideways or all of them are straight on. But you realize that this pose is much more natural, and literally, if you look at almost any portrait after this, they all utilize this technique. I would actually probably tell you the thing that is most remarkable about the Mona Lisa is that what Leonardo da Vinci figures out is the way our eyes work. If you notice that the Mona Lisa, who's in the foreground, is the most clear, but as you move a little bit away from her, things become slightly more blurry, and the things that are furthest away are the most blurry. This is the first painting to realize this perspective. Realizing the further out you go, it's called atmospheric perspective. The further you go away from something, like if I stare at you and you're right in front of me, the student behind you looks a little blurry, and the kid at the back of the room looks totally blurry. Leonardo figured out that's how people's eyes work. And before this, what would happen is when people painted any paintings, they would make the same level of detail in the background as the foreground. But that actually doesn't look right. But he figured out and incorporated it, and this becomes another standard of painting. Now, other things about it, why the Mona Lisa has driven people crazy, people have attacked it, people have kidnapped it. It has a way of affecting people, but that's something we can talk about in class. Sistine Chapel, this is Michelangelo's masterwork. It takes up the entire ceiling of a chapel. It shows heaven, hell, and earth. It's got the very famous part where Adam and God the Father's fingers touch. And there are literally hundreds and hundreds of different people depicted in different poses and situations. It's spectacular. If you ever get a chance, you should definitely check it out. In order to do this, he had to be on his back on a scaffolding lit with candlelight for months at a time to pull this off, on his back up in the air. Just to give you some more context to what it looks like. It's insane. It's just spectacular work. It's spectacular. Side note, actually, Michelangelo famously painted a few people he didn't like in the hell part. Oh, there it is. There's Adam and God the Father touching. Just to go on this, we've all seen the David statue, but first of all, the David's huge. It's 12, 13, 14, 15 feet tall. And if you look at the David, I don't want to spend too much time on this, but if you look at the level of detail he puts, let's just pick one thing. Before this, remember, a big part of the Renaissance is people are looking backwards saying, oh my goodness, these people were the people 1,500 years ago were better sculptors than us, better architects than us. This is the part where you can see that people are making a statement, specifically Michelangelo. Look at the eye of the David statue. Look at the eye. When Romans would do their work, they would just have a white pupil. Look, he carved the iris in there. He carves the cornea in there. He carves the crow's feet and the bags under his eye. Look at the eyebrows. Every part of the eyebrows are carved in. The hair, you can see his musculature, his clavicle underneath it. You can see his bone structure. This is a statement where Michelangelo is saying, I'm not as good as the people of the past. I'm better. And this isn't even his best sculpture. His best sculpture, without a doubt, considered one of the greatest works ever done by a human, is the Pieta. And we have a Pieta here at Moeller, and you can go check it out. It's down by the CLC. And there's so many things about the Pieta. It's not just the fact that you've got a man and a woman. You've got Mary holding the dead body of Jesus, and you've got all these flowing robes that look totally soft, but it's carved into incredibly hard stone. And it's not just that, like, you can actually see that as Mary's, like, her fingers are flexing, it's actually pushing part of Jesus's body, and he's totally limp, and you can see there's a rigidity because she's looking at her dead son and how soft her face looks. But even with all of that, the way you can tell there's a master at work here is he knows in order for this to have the maximum impact, he has to go outside the natural proportions of a human. So Mary here, and even though it looks completely natural, she's holding her dead son, if she stood up, she'd be 9 feet tall. She is way too big, but to the human eye, it looks awesome. it looks perfect, it looks right. But in order for her to hold Jesus like that, she would have to be huge. This is what we talk about, like when masters can go beyond what beyond the natural because it looks natural to you. They can break rules that a regular person can't, and it looks awesome. The frescoes, this is what I talked about with Raphael, where he would put pigment onto a wall as it was being constructed, and the two would fuse. This is the school of Athens. It runs on the side of the wall. This talks about Plato's school, which lasted 900 years, and it goes both up the wall and onto the ceiling. It's beautiful work. And the thing about this style, you had to work incredibly quickly because you're actually doing the work as the paint's fusing and the wall's drying. There's a close-up. See, Plato or Socrates right there. All right, so let's talk a little bit about someone that you guys know about because he's someone you've studied at least some of the books, and since you're a junior, you've read some of his stories, and that's William Shakespeare, often called the Bard, one of the greatest English authors in English history. Just understand how impactful Shakespeare is. Even if you've never read any of his works, which I know you guys are familiar with some of them, he introduced over 1,000 words to the English language. He had such a mastery of English, he could create words that just made sense, and then people started to use them in their vernacular. They just became part of the regular language of people. Some of his poems, Hamlet, Macbeth, Romeo and Juliet. What I would tell you is, yes, his poems or his plays are hard to understand because they're in Old English, which is one of the struggles with him. But the thing that is universal are the themes that he's talking about. Romeo and Juliet, a lot of times I'll hear students say it's about love. Romeo and Juliet, it's just not about love. It's about infatuation and obsession and how it can destroy everything around you. And if that's something you've never experienced, maybe it's best that you don't. But that's what it's about. It's about this all-consuming desire for another person. And what happens when that runs into another person that has the exact same thing? One I will give you that I remember we read it junior year, and I thought, it's all right, is Macbeth. Macbeth, as I've gotten older, it makes more sense because Macbeth is about power and how power corrupts people and how that corruption then weighs on their consciousness. As you get older and you get power, there are lessons in Macbeth to think about. And I remember I read it, it's like, oh, okay, whatever, but it didn't relate to me. As I've gotten older, Macbeth makes a ton of sense. Anyhow, so William Shakespeare, one of these great, right here in the middle of the Renaissance, one of these great artists. Okay, so earlier in the year, we talked about the innovation that occurred during the Song Dynasty, movable type. And what you see on the screen right now is movable type. But there's a man named Johannes Gutenberg that's going to take that and he's going to push it way further because he's going to turn this into what's called the printing press. Use that movable type, but put it in a machine now, in a mechanism, and then eventually that mechanism will be steam powered, and it'll be able to create pages and pages and pages and pages and pages super fast. And what that does is it becomes one of the major inflection points in human history, and that is not hyperbole. Because what happens with the printing press is, for the first time in history, rather than books to have to everything be handwritten or like every page is made one at a time, pages are just being created boom, 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 boom in the hundreds. And what that does is the more and the more pages you get and the more books you get, the price of books come down. And as the price of books come down, more people for the first time have access to books. And the more people have access to books for the first time in history, people can become literate. And the more people become literate, the more books they want. And the more books they want, there are more books available, which brings the price down of books even more. And there's an explosion of learning. There's an absolute explosion of learning, and it changes humanity because now people don't have to take other people's word for something. They can read it themselves. And then they can write and they can transfer knowledge in books to the next generation. Like, think about everything that you know came from someone before you. Like, what we know of the world, and this idea that I can transfer it to the next generation and that generation can improve on that and send it to the next generation. All this happens because of Johannes Gutenberg's printing press. It is a critical moment where you take that movable type, but you put it in machine form and eventually it becomes steam powered. Of course, the first, if you've ever heard the Gutenberg Bible, it's the first book that they'd printed. It was the Bible. So section 3, the Reformation begins. Go ahead and put that on there. We're going to talk about Martin Luther, who breaks away from the church. Okay, so we talked about this earlier. When the church starts to get involved in the world, that there's going to be some corruptions. And during this period, we call this a Reformation period, which means to reform means to fix something, and specifically what needs to be fixed is a Catholic Church. Parts, not the whole church, but there are individuals in the church who became very corrupt because they became so wealthy during the Middle Ages. Catholics believe in a thing called an indulgence. An indulgence is a sacrifice that you can give up to help, because Catholics believe that people, when you die, either go to heaven, hell, or purgatory. Purgatory is a place in which people's the selfishness and the sins that they accumulated during their life are purged out of them. Catholics don't know how long you're in there. You could be in there for a day or a million years. Who knows? So it's very prevalent with Catholics to pray for the dead. Like if someone's, like, if your mom's in purgatory, you'd pray for her so you can get out earlier. So an indulgence, you can give up money, because giving up money is a sacrifice, right? You give money to help get your loved one out of purgatory, or you can pray for them, or you can do acts of charity. What happened in some parts of the church is that people, an indulgence against that giving the money part, which is sacrifice, some places in the church started to get treated out of get out of hell card. Like if I gave money to the church, I would just go straight to heaven. And that's not the Catholic belief, but in some parts of the church, people were doing that. Some bishops were very corrupt. And so people start to criticize, and they say, hey, the church and the Pope has become too connected to the world. It's impacting the fidelity to the church. There's a Catholic priest named Martin Luther. He is a Catholic priest, and he says, look, this teaching of indulgences is wrong. And what he does is he breaks away from the church. He challenges the church. He famously takes what he calls the 95 Theses. It's a list of his arguments against indulgences, and he nails it to a cathedral door. And by doing that, he's saying these are wrong. These are corruptions of the actual faith, the Christian faith. And he says, and this is a major point, that salvation cannot be achieved through good works at all. That's not a part of it. It's only through faith alone. And because of that, a new branch of Christianity is going to be formed. Any new Christian faith that becomes a part of this is called a Protestant church or a protest church. They're protesting what the Catholic Church is doing, and they form a new variation of Christianity. So again, the 95 Thesis is his document that's against indulgences, and you start getting this new form, and the new form of Christianity I've figured out is called Lutheranism. Oh, that's him nailing it to the cathedral. So the new faith that comes forth from Martin Luther is Lutheranism. There are three major parts: grace alone, faith alone, and scripture alone. Two, for the purpose of this class, is one is faith alone, sole fide, right? Faith alone will get you to heaven. You don't need to do works associated with that to tap into the grace from the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ. You just have to be faithful. Believe that Jesus is your Lord and Savior, and you will go to heaven. The other one is the Bible alone, sola scriptura. In the Catholic faith, since the beginning of the church, you had all the apostles and people passing on oftentimes traditions, oral traditions, and different understandings of the faith. But Martin Luther has a different understanding. He says the Bible is the only inherently truthful information to get about God's plan of salvation through the church. So you have this Reformation period where you have these groups trying to reform the church, and you get the Counter-Reformation where the church is going to reform itself. And because when Martin Luther breaks away, you start to get a lot of different new Protestant faiths. You get Calvinism, you actually have the Lutherans, and you get all these different groups, the Baptists, the Anabaptists. All these groups start to break away from the church. You now have millions of Protestants, millions of Protestant Christians in Europe, and you have millions of Catholics in Europe, and there's a lot of fighting and warring between the two groups. And so there's this massive tensions that are forming. And so what the church then does is it attempts to reform itself. And the way it does that oftentimes in history, and we talked about this earlier, where is the church will use different orders. And the order at this time that is formed is called the Society of Jesus, which you would better known as the Jesuits. Yes, St. X is a Jesuit school. The guys that, one, obviously the Pope is a part of the creation of that, and also St. Ignatius of Loyola. And the idea that Jesuits really focus on is education. The Jesuits, I don't think it's controversial to say, are the most educated order in the Catholic faith. The idea is that through enough education, people would be able to minister to others. Just to give you an idea of this, the Jesuits are so well educated that they learn Mandarin and they go to China. China at this time in history lets no one in. But then you've got these white Europeans come to the border and they start speaking their language back at them and they let them in, which is why the Catholic faith gets into China. And the Jesuits go into the Americas. And because of that, they actually start learning a lot of the Native American languages and they start writing down some of the history. Some of the only histories from some of the different Native groups are because Jesuits wrote their histories down. And that's that massive education piece that the Jesuits believe in. I was watching on TV one time, they had a Jesuit priest who you have to go through 8 years of schooling to be a priest, was also a medical doctor and a lawyer. Imagine the amount of years that would take. But that's not necessarily, he's not necessarily the only one in the Jesuit order like that. So where do these other Christian faiths come from? The other one I'm going to focus on is King Henry VIII in England. So King Henry VIII was a man with large appetites. He was a very big guy, and when I mean big, he was very large. He was 300 some pounds, and he took over England. It was a very wealthy country at that time, and he would often eat to the point where he actually had a vomitorium next to him, and he would eat to the point where he'd make himself sick and throw up into the bucket. So he had these big appetites. And he ruled from 1509 to 1547, and he killed thousands of people during his era. But as notable as that is, and that's not necessarily an unusual thing for any absolute monarch, but what is notable is the fact that he creates his own faith. And how that happens is because of a dispute he has between the Catholic Church. Henry gets married, and his wife, what does a king want more than anything else? He wants an heir, and specifically he wants a male heir to be his son so he can hand his kingdom off to that. But he is not getting a male heir from his first wife, I believe it was Anne Boleyn. And so he goes to the church and he says, hey, I would like an annulment. An annulment within the Catholic faith and even the American government means a marriage never took place. So it means that someone maybe wasn't in the right state of mind. Maybe they were out of their mind. They couldn't, or maybe they were under duress. Someone was threatening them. You can't get married outside of your free will and full mental consent. So he said, look, I married this lady, but I want an annulment. I want you to make it so the marriage never happened. Well, the church says, no. You knew what you were doing when you married her. And because of that, he breaks away from the church and he creates his own church, all based on this desire for a new wife. At this time in history, they actually believed that it was the female that determined the sex of the next child. We know today that it's actually the male, but let's get into the components of this. So here are the 6 wives of Henry, and you don't have to necessarily know these, but here they are. So Catherine of Aragon was first. Here they are. So 2 of these women he ends up divorcing. He ends up murdering another 2 of them. One of them dies, and one for a long time was jailed. So how does Henry's actions impact England and the world? So what Henry does, because the church will not grant him an annulment, he does this thing called the Act of Supremacy, and he says the head of the Church of England is not the Pope, it's the King or the Queen. And he declares himself basically his own Pope, his own religious leader. And by doing this now, he's actually created a new faith, and it's called the Anglican Church. It has a few names. The Anglican Church, the Church of England, or in the United States, it's often called the Episcopal Church. And so, based on this, it's actually, as Protestant faiths go, it is actually the most similar in the way it looks to, if you ever go to an Episcopal service, it looks very much like a Catholic service. And the reason why is much of the traditions were kept, except you had to now declare loyalty to Henry. So all the bishops were given a choice, and all the priests were given a choice inside of England. They said, hey, you're now a part of this new church or you will die. Some people, like St. Thomas More, said, no, I'm not going to serve you. And he murdered them, even if they were his friends. He would kill them because they now had to be loyal to him and not the Catholic Church or the Pope. So that's where we get the Anglican Church. And so this matters. So you've got this breakaway with Martin Luther, with Lutheranism, you get Calvinists, Baptists, Anabaptists, and you now get the Anglican Church. And what then starts to happen is you start to get splinter groups from each of those groups, and more and more and more faiths. Someone changes a tenet or a dogma, then you get a new faith and a new faith and a new faith. All right, so this is our last section. We're all done, and so this is it for the semester. We're going to do this last section, and this is actually going to perfectly bridge into what we cover in January with the Enlightenment. So this is called the scientific revolution. This is a new way of thinking about the universe in which math is believed to govern the laws of nature. Before this, people had superstitious beliefs, but now this idea that nature is following certain laws, and this goes back to the philosophers. If we can understand those laws, if we understand the math and the reasoning for that, we can understand it. If we understand it, we can master it. If we master it, we can at least possibly control it. And this is called the scientific revolution. During the scientific revolution, there's a guy named Sir Francis Bacon, by the way, a Catholic. He came up with this idea that conclusions should only be made through experimentation, right? If you're going to have an idea, if you're going to have a belief in something, you need to have an experiment that backs that up. And so this leads, of course, to something you should be doing in all your science classes called the scientific method, right? And so I posted the scientific method here on the slide: question, hypothesis, experiment, observe, record, analysis, share results. Also, there's another part. You need to be able to replicate the study. And so the idea of during this time period, you're going to use logic and reason and experiments to reach conclusions. I'll give you an example of why this matters so much for this time period. Before the scientific revolution, there was this belief in this thing called spontaneous genesis. People just accepted it, that things came from nothing. And I'll give you an example. If a piece of meat was left outside, a rotting piece of meat was left outside, that what appears on it? Maggots appear on it, and then maggots turn into flies. And that was just accepted. Okay, those things come from nowhere. That's spontaneous genesis. That's the way the world works. People now started to ask questions about everything. Well, they wanted to question spontaneous genesis. Well, we all believe in that. So what did they do is they took a piece of rotting meat and they would then cover it with glass. And they would notice that, hey, wait a minute, there's no maggots on that anymore. Yes, it's still rotting. Yes, it's in the heat, but nothing is appearing on it. So that means something actually put the maggots on the meat, which we now know flies lay eggs onto things. Those eggs hatch into larvae. The larvae are maggots. The maggots then turn into flies. They didn't know that. They just accepted that that was the way the universe worked at that time in history. Let me give you one more example of a belief in the past that was now challenged. And the belief is, of course, if I had like a grape and I dropped a 100,000-pound boulder at the same time, which one's going to hit the ground first? You may know the answer to this, but people back then didn't. People always assumed that the lighter thing would hit the ground second, the heavier thing hits the ground first. Well, that's not how the world works. Gravity pulls everything the same. So when you drop two things, if I drop my shoe and one, like a car key, they're going to hit at the same time. If I drop a desk and I drop, a 1 pound book, they're going to hit at the same time. Gravity pulls on everything the same, but at this time in history, people didn't have any idea of that. And so this is where they start to test everything. And that goes back to Sir Francis Bacon and the scientific method, which is why it matters, which is why in science classes, that's what you have to do. You have to go through this process to see what is replicatable. First of these people I want to cover is Nicholas Copernicus. Copernicus is often viewed as the first modern astronomer. People have been astronomers since the beginning of time. Everyone who looks up at night in awe and sees the beauty and the majesty of the universe and stars and the planets. People have known, by the way, that they could tell for thousands of years the difference between a star and a planet at nighttime, right? What's the difference? Stars flicker, and planets, the light remains constant because the sun is always hitting them. But we call him the first modern astronomer because he poses a theory that is much closer to what the universe actually looks like than the previous one. He proposes what's called the heliocentric model of the universe. Helio meaning sun, like hell, hot, sun. Helio, sun-centered model of the universe. This replaces, well, remember we came out, Aristotle had this conception of the universe that was the geocentric. Geo, like geography, meaning earth-centered. The ancients believed that the earth was the center of the universe. And I have to tell you, like, it actually makes sense because the reason why they think that is they can see clearly things are rotating around, and they just assume that things are rotating around the Earth. But now Copernicus says, well, yeah, I see things are rotating, but it's not the Earth they're rotating around. Yes, the moon is rotating around the Earth, but all these other things, including the Earth, are actually rotating around the sun. And so this is what heliocentric model would look like, where the sun is in the middle of the universe and everything is rotating around that. Now, is this true? This is closer to the truth, but the reason why I would say, okay, are we in a heliocentric model? Yes and no. Our solar system is heliocentric. Like, the sun gives off such tremendous gravity. Gravity is an energy of attraction that's the larger something is, the more gravity, the more attraction it sends out there. Even the asteroids and the comets that fly through our solar system are pulled by the sun. But is the entire universe pulled by our sun? Not at all, right? So our solar system is just one of thousands, tens of thousands in our galaxy, and they're rotating around our galactic center, and then those galaxies are rotating around other galaxies. So the universe is massive and unimaginably large, but the heliocentric model is a much closer model to what the universe actually looks like. Now, the thing about that is Copernicus wasn't taken seriously because there was no way for him to prove. I mean, his model makes sense. He's looking up, he's like making observations, but really couldn't prove his model. The person who actually helps prove his model is a guy named Galileo Galilei. He is a physicist, mathematician, and astronomer, and he creates the first Galilean telescope. And so telescopes have been around for a long time. They were invented in the Middle East. The idea of a telescope is very simple, right? You use multiple lenses which magnify the vision of something, and you can see something further away, closer. So Galileo made some tweaks to that, and he started observing the universe. And when he does that, he says, oh man, everything is revolving around the sun. And for that, he ends up getting persecuted, ends up under house arrest with church, because some people take it as a challenge to that God made the earth the center of the universe. So he ends up spending. Now, he was a good Catholic, and he accepted that house arrest, but there's certainly no conflict between that idea. But back then, people thought, well, it's a challenge. So he ends up under house arrest for the rest of his life. Now, I do want to show you how hardcore Galileo is. Galileo didn't just study universal patterns. He also studied the sun. And I don't know if you guys are aware of this, but the sun has sunspots. Sunspots are darkened areas of the sun that are on the surface of the sun that travel on the sun. It has to do with the way the gravity is affecting those parts. So those parts are darker. And he used to had a notebook and he would track them. Now, I'm sure everyone in this room has, at some point when you were little, you probably stared at the sun and you're like, oh my goodness, my eyes are burning. Well, I want you to imagine doing that, but now imagine staring at the sun with a telescope. And so Galileo most likely went blind because he stared at the sun, and he was such a dutiful scientist. He used the sun, he used his telescope to track all the movements of these sunspots, which by the way we do today, but we use equipment to do that, and he probably like burned his eyes out. That is a hardcore scientist, by the way. The last person we're going to talk about for this unit, this is the big finale. This is the person who's often selected. Every year, scientists come together and they decide who is the smartest man to ever live. They vote on it every year. And I have to tell you, almost every single year, the same person's name is picked, and it's Sir Isaac Newton. Sir Isaac, even Einstein said that he is the smartest human to ever live. Sir Isaac Newton, who was also born on Christmas Day, famously. So, how smart is Isaac Newton? Isaac Newton has a couple interesting characteristics. So, for example, Isaac Newton started to track the movement of planets, but he was having a hard time with it, and he realized that there was no current mathematics that he could use to do that. So he co-develops calculus, an entire mathematical field, just so he can track interplanetary movement. That was he wanted to do it, so he created an entire field of math, calculus. He invents it to do that. He wrote the book, The Mathematical Principles of Nature. He also explained. He also came up with the conception of the theory of gravity. The larger something is, the more attraction it gives out, the more energy it attracts and pulls things. That's Isaac Newton. And this book that he wrote about all these things is considered one of the most important books in human history. Now, there's a very famous, and I'll show you, look, I have this amazing PowerPoint that's going to break this down for you. There's a famous story, here it is, boop, that Sir Isaac Newton was sitting under an apple tree, and an apple hit him on the head. And from that apple hitting him on the head, which this probably may not be true, but we don't know, he wondered to himself, he sat there and he said, well, why is it that that apple came down and didn't go up? And that's a great question, right? Like, I think we think that when we're a little kid. At some point, when we're a little kid, we're like, why can't we fly? And that is a critical question. So this explains a lot about the Renaissance and the scientific revolution. People start to ask the question, why things work the way they do. That idea, all the misconceptions of the past need to now be removed, and you have to prove any ideas that you have. You have to actually prove them. Anyhow, that is this unit. I'm all done. I hope that made sense. If you have any questions, shoot Mr. Rico an email.